Good to see you all. I hope Yontif went well. We have a shir tonight, and we have one more shir before the summer next week, Amir Hashem. For those of you who can make it, we look forward to a wrap-up shir, I guess. So I think the last
we're not going to study all summer.
What's that?
We're not going to study all summer. You did that one year. I think the first year.
Oh yeah, I did during COVID. I was around, but I'm going to be a little bit on the road this summer. But I appreciate being missed, and definitely you want to study over the summer. Just but the share will resume in Mir Hashem when the new year begins, and we'll be learning Bab Metzia. That's the plan, which is a very challenging limud. Yeah. Anyways, I think the last year was supposed to be, as I recall, a Yavamos year, but we switched it to a pre-Shavuos year at the last minute. So we're going to pick up to where we would have been, but in that last year, and that is, if you have the Marmakomos, it's Be'inyan Yibum Besotav Umatsu Grushasa. It's a You should have them, hopefully. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with the Gemara on Yud Aleph Amud Aleph 11a.
Yud Aleph Amud Aleph.
Yud Aleph 11a.
Yes. I'm going to get the Gemara. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. I don't want to disturb you, Rabbi.
No. I thought you said the wrong number.
Okay.
I just didn't hear it so clearly. Okay. We'll wait 1 minute for the.
No, Rabbi. Please start. I can hear you.
Okay, good. Okay, so in the Marmakomos, it's the first entry, and in the Gemara, it's the Gemara in Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, and it is 3-6, about 10 lines up from the bottom of the page for those of you following in the Gemara itself. So the Gemara says, Omar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Sora Sota Asura Tumaksivba Ka'arayas. Now, this is a very fascinating Gemara. We've touched on it before. The Gemara came up earlier in the parak on Av Gimel Amud Beis, but now we're going to there we discussed the tzara implications of it, you could call it, and now we're going to discuss the issue itself. So the Gemara says that according to Rav, what is the case? If you look at Rashi, he says tzaras erva asura hayan asui beis nashim. Let's say he had Ruvain, a man, and he was married to 2 wives. Let's say he had a wife named Sarah and a wife named Rivka. The Zinsa ha'achas tachtav, one of his wives was unfaithful to him. Terrible thing. She betrayed the marriage. That's called a sota. And the Yesh Edim, it's not an accusation, right? It's there's evidence, definitive evidence that she betrayed the marriage vow, right? And then, with everything going on, umes below banim, Ruvain dies. He doesn't leave behind any children. He has a brother named Shimon. So now there's a potential yibum situation between Shimon and one of the wives of Ruvain. Ruvain's 2 wives are Sarah, we'll call her the good wife, and Rivka, the sota, the bad wife. So now the question is, does the behavior of Rivka with Ruvain, does that eliminate anybody from Yibum with Shimon? Everybody with me? So what Rashi explains is he v'tzara, so that's what the Rav said, that a tzara sota is asura. What that means is, not only is the guilty unfaithful wife, not only is she excluded as a Yibum partner, but her co-wife, who remained faithful and loyal, Sarah, she's also cannot be a Yavama to Shimon. And it's because of the unfaithfulness of one wife, both wives are excluded. The whole din of Yibum is excluded. And the right way that Rashi and Tosos and the Rambam and the Ramban, and we'll see the exceptions in a minute, but most Rishonim are the opinion that this exclusion of both wives is not only for Yibum, but af mina chalitza. It also is an exclusion from chalitza, meaning not only can Sarah and Rivka not become the Yavama wives of Shimon, they don't need chalitza in order to simply, move on with their lives with someone else. There's no zika of chalitza under these circumstances. My tama, what's the reason? So the Gemara explains, because tuma ksive, what does it say, tuma? This is a pasuk. It seems like every week, I don't know why this is the case, but no matter where we are, what shir we're in, it seems like every week is the Parshas HaShavua. So we just read Parshas Naso, right, on Shabbos. At least in Queens, that's what we were reading. I assume in Manhattan as well. So it's the pasuk v'nistra v'hinitma b'midbar hey is the pasuk that we read last week in the Kriyas HaTorah. The Parsha of Sota is in the Kriyas HaTorah of Parshas Naso. So that language of Tuma, says the Gemara, Tzoras Tuma Sota Asura, Tuma Ksiv Karayos, and look at Rashi Karayos, Ksiv Al Titamu B'Cholela. So let me explain what, the bigger, let's say, implications of this. So let's explain. So a woman was unfaithful to her husband. That's a terrible thing, obviously. And the consequences of that, all things being equal, forget about the punishment part for now. But let's say in terms of the marriage, so the marriage is basically over, but she needs a get. In other words, the sota needs a get in order to move on with her life. But even if the husband was to agree to overlook the infidelity, he doesn't have the right to do that. If it's been determined vadai, then they can no longer continue as husband and wife. That's the isur of sota. However, several things need to be said about this isur sota lebala, meaning there's a prohibition to continue living as husband and wife for Ruvain and Rivka, but several things need to be explained. This prohibition is chayve lavit. It's not kares. There's no capital offense here. It's a lav. The reason that's important is, as we know, the 15 ervas of the Mishnah in Yevamos on that base are from the parsha of Achrei Mos and Kedoshim. They are capital offenses, either bidei shamayim or even bidei adam, kares and skila, all those kind of things. Sota is not a capital offense; it's a lav. The importance of that, is not just the severity of the onesh, but the category of erva. Normally, sota is not called an erva, except here in this Gemara, where we're told that tuma ksivba ke'arayos. The Torah uses the expression v'nistra v'hinitma'a, and in Parshas Arayos, erva is called tuma. So by extension and by equation, right, sota is called tuma equals erva. But it's not in the list in Achrei Mos, and it's not in the list in Parshas Kedoshim, and it's only chayve lav, and it's not chayve krisos. I don't mean to belittle it, but it isn't in that category. And not only that, but the Gemara says in Yevamos, and Daf Mem Tes, we talked about this in context where we studied the problem of Nida. The Gemara says that Hakol Modim, everybody agrees that number one, there's Tfisas Kiddushin in Sota, meaning he's not allowed to live with her because she betrayed the marriage. So he's supposed to divorce her. Let's say he divorces her and they decide they want to get married again. So the Kiddushin would be Chal. I mean, if they got married, she would be his wife, not permitted to live with him, and it's not permitted to marry her, but it would be Chal. Just like, for example, if a Grusha were to marry a Kohen, that's a prohibited relationship, but the Kiddushin is Chal. I mean, it is a marriage. It's just a prohibited relationship, as opposed to, let's say, a person wants to marry his wife's sister. That's erva. That's in Parshas Achrei Mos Kedoshim. The Kiddushin isn't even Chal in that case. These are madregos. They are different levels. Another example, the Gemara says that there's Tfisas Kiddushin for Sota, And also, there's no mamzerus for sota, meaning if he were to have a child going forward with this wife who betrayed him, who he's prohibited to live with, the child that was produced would not be a mamzer. As opposed to, for example, one of the ervas, with the exception of Nida, but his wife's sister, his father's wife, meaning his stepmother, his his wife's daughter, whoever's on the list in Achramos and Kedoshim, with the exception of Nida, right? There's no Tfisas Kedushin, and if there was a child, there would be Mamzerus.
Rabbi,
That's not true for Sota. Yes.
Rabbi, you touch on a point that I questioned for some time. In Kedoshim, it actually says, Eshet Ach, they will not have children. It doesn't say any other punishment. It just said that they will be barren. That's the punishment.
I have to look at the pasuk. But Eshes Ach is, no, it says Aririm Yu doesn't just mean barren. That's the rabbis understand that that's a punishment, and it's also a way of, the halacha is that they are in violation of a capital offense. It may be bidei shamayim. We leave it in divine. It's a divine capital offense, not one that is executed or implemented, in a human court. Some are and some are not. But it is all of them are capital, offenses in Achramos and Kedoshim. Again, we can look at the pasuk if we have time a little bit later. But the brother you're talking about, Eshes Ach, without Hebrew, so that appears in both lists, both in Achramos and in Kedoshim. But everything in those lists is a capital violation. Just that many of them are what we call bidei shamayim, not bidei adam. But in terms of tfisas kiddushin and in terms of mamzerus, with the exception of nida, they all have that characteristic. So my bigger point that I'm trying to make is that the Gemara here says sota because it says tuma is treated as erva. But what I'm trying to explain is it's not on the list. It's not a capital offense. There is tfisas kiddushin. There's no mamzerus. Meaning in the four ways that characterize the list in Achramos and Kedoshim, sota falls short in all of them. Now, what does the Gemara mean then? So the answer is what the Gemara is telling you is that this is a legal category, meaning we know that sota isn't actually an erva. Sota has a din of erva, meaning, so it's a very interesting question. For example, the Minchas Chinuch raises the question. We say that, on Gimel Averos, there are three cardinal sins. Talked about this when we talked about Nida. Even Pikuach Nefesh, even loss of life, is not an excuse to violate. Right? There's a principle of Yaharig Val Yavar, namely, you lose your life rather than violate. Those three, of course, are Shvichus Damim, taking another life. You're not allowed to take another life. If somebody says, kill him or I'll kill you, you still have no right to violate. That's Shvichus Damim. Avodah Zarah, right? Idol worship, meaning Avodah Zarah. And the other is arayos, meaning certain illicit relationships. So what illicit relationships? So certainly the ervas, some of the Mefarshim are the opinion that it's limited to the more severe ones, like in Parshas Achramos and Kedoshim. What about sota? It's not an Achramos Kedoshim, but our Gemara here in Yevamos says tumaksiv bekarayos. So with respect to Yeharig Vayavor, or another halacha that we discussed regarding Nida, the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph, speaks about matzilin oso benafsho. Again, that if a person is forcing another person to have a physical relationship with them, and we're talking about a severe infraction, so matzilin oso benafsho, the only way you can stop the person from forcing themselves, on some other party is by by killing them. So matzil and also benafsha, you're allowed to do that. Does that apply in the case of sota to maksiv bo ke'erva? So the answer is it's not clear. We don't have definitive information, but it's a question that is discussed by the poskim. At the core of the question is how to read this line in the Gemara, because sota is not an erva, but tumaksiv ba ke'erva, and therefore, according to Rashi and Tosas and the Rambam and the Ramban and so on, there is no chalitza in the context of Yibum. And even not only is the guilty party excluded, but there is also the extension to a din of tzara. So that's why you can imagine whenever you have a legal category that is not the actual definition, but is kind of a legal extension, it's always a kind of ambiguous question where you draw the line and what applications to the primary category apply and what do not. So that's an interesting issue. For example, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik and Chidush Reb Chaim Alevi al Rambam in Perek Vav Hilchos Yibum v'Chalitza Halacha Yud Tes. I hope we'll get a chance to speak about it more. If not tonight, then next week. Has a comment in which he says that this din of the Gemara, this chiddush, that tzara sota asura tumaksiv bekarayos, is such a chiddush that it only applies to Yibum. Now, he doesn't say explicitly it doesn't apply to Yehorim Vayavor or Matzilin. He doesn't make mention of the Minchas Chinuch's question or doubt, but he could have. It's his way of saying, in my opinion, this is a very circumscribed, very limited, halacha. This, law, which isn't a factual erva in any way, but has the equivalent status of an erva, right? It's a very limited concept. Indeed, this is an interesting issue when it comes to another Gemara we're going to look at in a minute. Let's look at it now, actually. If you turn to the Gemara in Daf Chaf Amud Aleph, and it's on the bottom of page 1, probably, or maybe it's on page 2 already, probably bottom of page 1 in our Mar Makomos. You have Masnisin, Klal, you have Yivamas Chaf Amud Aleph. Klal Omer Bivama Kolshi Asura Erba Lo Koletzes Shlomis Yavemas.
So where is it in the Gemara?
It's the Mishnah and the Gemara in Chaf Amud Aleph, 20a.
Oh, yeah. You mean Klal Amru Bivama?
Yeah. So let's look at this for a minute. You'll see a very interesting thing. And we'll look in the sheets for the Rishonim in a minute. So the Mishnah says, Klal Amru B'Yavam. The principle was articulated, right, regarding Yavama. So that's a big sweeping statement, when you have a Mishnah like that. Klal Amru. Why don't they just go and say the Klal? They announce, it's like, there's a bang on the table, a clap on the shulchan. Klal Amru B'Yavama. What's it going to be? What is it? Kolshi Isra Erva. Whenever there's an Erva type Isra, like in the first Mishnah, the 15, Lo Choletzes V'lo Misyabemes. There's no Yibum, there's no Halitza. On the other hand, Isra Mitzvah V'Isra Kedusha Choletzes V'lo Misyabemes. On the other hand, if you have just Chayve Lavin, like a Grusha Lekohen or something like that, so there is no Yibum, but there is Chalitza. We've discussed this and seen this Mishnah many times over the year. Why is it important? So the Gemara zeroes in on this language, Klal Omru B'Yavama. Just like, plop on the bima. Like, what do you need it for? Just say what you want to say. So the Gemara says, Klal Asuye Mai. Like, what's the point of this broader statement? What's the word klal or this presentation? What is it intended to add? So the Gemara says, Amar from Bar Papa, La Suye Tsaras Islandis, Ukadravasi. So some people said to include the tsara, the co-wife of an islandess. An islandess is a woman who physically cannot bear children. Since she can't bear children, she's not a candidate for Yibum, because part of Yibum is Lahakim La'achiv Shem B'Yisrael. And according to Ravasi, even the tsara, even the co-wife is excluded because it's like she becomes an Eshes Achiv Shalom B'Mokom Yibum, and that's an erva, and therefore excludes the tsara as well. Okay, that's not our problem. I'm sorry, did somebody want to say something?
No,
okay.
That's okay.
Okay. The Ika de Amri, Kol Isura Isur Erva, Hudasira Tsarasa, Holo Isura Isur Erva, Tsarasa Lo Asira, Lemute Mai, Raframama Lemute Tsaras Islanders, Lo Krabas. Some people say this is to exclude Tsaras Islanders, some say it's to include, etc. What does this have to do with us? We're talking about Sota now, right? So if you look at Tosfos on the spot, and we have it in the Marmakomos as well, Tosa says, La Suye Tsaras Islandis on the top of the page, second Tosa on the top of the page, but you can skip to the end of the Tosas. Go to the last 4 lines. Tosa says, why don't we give a simpler explanation in the Gemara? Hodelo ka'amar la Suye Tsaras Sota, Vitsaras Maxu Grushaso. Why not say that the Mishnah, which says, Klal Omru biyavama, kol shi isur erva lo chaletzas v'lo misyavemes. Any erva is excluded for yibum mechalitza. Maybe it comes to include sota. Why dafka islandess? Because sota, we also say that there's no yibum, at least according to the Balitosis and Rashi understanding, and the Ramban and the Rambam. We'll see the exceptions in a minute. That in sota there's no chalitza and there's no yibum because tumaksiv baka erva. So why not say that the klal comes to teach you this din, the din of sota and masu grushaso. So Tosa says, interesting answer. He means it technically. Mishum the island is dami tfei la rayos, shemuteres lameis vasuros liyava. So Tosa says, because we're looking for cases where the problem is the relationship between the yavam and the potential yavama. Not a problem between the husband and the wife. And the problem of Sota and the problem of Masu Grushaso is not between the Yavam and the Yavama. She didn't betray him. He's the brother. She betrayed her husband. So that's not parallel to the mission. Okay, that in itself is very interesting food for thought, which we're going to get back to in a minute. And that is, when we talk about the 15 arayos in the Mishnah on Daf Beis, there are all cases where there's a problem. What's illicit about those relationships? The answer is the problem, the illicit character of the relationship stems from the potential union of the candidates, the Yavam and the Yavama. Meaning, Ruvain married Shimon, his brother's daughter, his niece. He's allowed to do that. So Ruvain married his niece. Ruvain died. And now the niece is a Yibum candidate to Shimon, her father. That's totally unacceptable. That's an incestuous relationship. And that's one of the ervas of the Mishnah. So when we talk about all the cases of erva in the Mishnah, they're all problems in the union of the Yavam and the Yavama. There's an obstacle to doing Yibum that didn't exist for the husband and wife, but now that we're talking about the brother, right, and his sister-in-law, let's say there's a problem. However, that's not what happens in Sota. In Sota, the problem is between the husband and the wife. There's no problem between the Yavam and the Yavama. They don't have any problematic structural or other relationship. There's no lav, never mind erva. So that's what Tosas, now Tosas makes that point. That's a critical point. The Rambam makes this point in Yad HaChazaka. In Perek Vav, Hilchos Yibum B'Chalitza, what is it, Halacha, I believe Yud Gimel. The Rambam talks about Matsu Grushaso, a similar case where a man divorced his wife. She subsequently got remarried to someone else. She got married to someone else, sorry. And then either he died or they got divorced, and now she wants to remarry, or they want to remarry, meaning the first couple. So the halacha is that a matzu grushaso is asur if there was an intervening marriage, as we've been discussing. So again, with the Gemara on Yud Aleph of a days, after it speaks about sota, speaks about matzu grushaso, and the Gemara says there's no yibum in that case, meaning if he would illegally remarry her, I mean the husband and the wife would illegally get remarried, right, and then he would die and not leave any children, there would be no yibum. Shimon would not be able to be miyabim, right, the matzu grushaso wife of Reuben. So the case of sota and the case of matzu grushaso are totally different than the standard cases of chayve krisus, erva, chayve lavin. In all those other cases, the problem is that there is a halachic obstacle between the yavam and the yavama. But in the case of sota and matzu grushaso, all the problems were in the original marriage, not in the potential union of yavam and yavama. So, well, that's an important difference, which we're going to get to in a minute. In fact, there isn't even a lav, really. I mean, the lav of sota and the lav of matzu grushaso relates to the husband and the wife.
On condition that she does not marry anybody in between.
And we're talking about a case in matzu grushaso. In illegal matzu grushaso is a case where she did marry someone in between. Otherwise, it would be permissible, except for a kohen. An Ashes kohen would not be allowed to do that, even if there was no, because she has a status of grusha, even though she's grusha mimenu, but it's still grusha. So even if there was no intervening relationship, there would still be a matzu grushaso problem for a kohen. But kohen aside, that's the distinction that we make. If there was an intervening marriage, then there's no return. If there's no intervening marriage, even if there was, by the way, a physical relationship, in between, let's say znus, but there was no, formal marriage, even then it would be permissible. But once there's another marriage, that's a different story. Anyways, getting back to it. So what Tosas points out about the difference between, klal gadol amru b'yavama, and the difference between islandness and one hand and sota and matzu grushaso on the other is it's a technical answer, but it's an answer that highlights the category that this is a totally different concept. But the Ramban and the Rashba go even further. So look on page 2 of the page 2. Hold on one second. Look on page 2 of the Mar Makomos. No, I take it back. Look on page 3 of the Mar Makomos. Everybody see that? It says Chidushei Haramban Masechet Yevamos Chaf Amud Aleph. We'll get back to the other one in a minute. Does everybody have that? Who has the sheets and who's looking to follow? There's an entry. I have it on page 3 that says Chidushei Haramban Masechet Yevamos Daf Chaf Amud Aleph. Klal Asuyei Mai. Okay, I'm going to pause for one more second.
Yes, we have it. We have our microphones muted not to make noise and interrupt the class.
Oh, okay. That's a good value. I applaud that. But I also just want to make sure that I'm not leaving you behind. Okay. You're doing what you should be doing, and hopefully I'm doing what I should be doing. Okay. So the Gemara, the Ramban comments on Klal Asuyei Mai. Amar Rafram Lasuyei Tzoros Islandus Kravasi. Says the Ramban, Haidelo Amar Masu Grushaso, Bishum Dahasam Lekula Alma Choletzes, Balav Ervahi. Okay, that's one answer. In the case of the Masu Grushaso, there's Chalitza, even though there's no Yibam. But he also adds that it's not Erva. Umasnisan Erva Ktani Velo Choletzes Velo Misavem Es Ktani. What about Sota? That's what I really care about. The Tsara Sota Nami Lo Asya, listen to this. The Lav Isur Ervahi. This is a terrific Ramban. Ramban says it's true that the Gemara on Yud Aleph Amud Aleph says there's no chalitza and there's no yibum and there's a tin of tzara because tumaksiv bo karayos. But just because it says that, that's not a substitute for actually being an erva. It's not an achremos. I'm adding. There's no problem of tfisas kedushin. There's no problem of mamzerus. There's no onesh misa. So there's a din of tumak sibba karayos. But that doesn't make it an erva. And what does the Mishnah say? Klal omer bivama kolshi isur erva. It isn't really an isur erva. It just has the equivalent effect of that. So that's the Ramban saying, right? Don't see this as an absolute equation. But then if you continue, the Ramban has a different answer where he says exactly the opposite. Go down one line. The Ramban says, V'yesh mefarshim, Dilo osir michlala, mishum dekiva de tumak sivba karayos, isura isur ervahi, ubelo kal isa b'masnisin. This is the Ramban saying the opposite, which is fine. I mean, the Ramban, is basically weighing the possibilities. What does Ramban say? The Mishnah says, Klal omer bivama, and the Gemara says, La suye mai. La suye mai means, when you say this is the principle, it sounds like there are the cases that you are enumerating. And beyond those cases, there's a principle that allows you to expand the application of the principle in a logical way, but it's an expansion by virtue of the fact that there's a recognition that what you're expanding to is not exactly the same. I mean, it has a different identity, right, than the original. So you have the original, and you say za klal, so that you can, deduct, and extract and apply. However, says the Ramban. So in the first answer, the Ramban was saying it's an application, but it doesn't come under the rubric of Isur Erva. It's not Erva enough. The second answer of the Ramban is exactly the opposite. The Ramban says, Tumak Sivba Ke'erva. It's legally Erva. That's not Klal, Amru. That's not Lisuye. The next slide, it says Kol She'isur. It is an Isur Erva. So the Ramban goes from saying, it's not Erva enough to saying it's completely Erva. It's not even an addition to Erva or an expansion of Erva. So in this again, it's a linguistic question and problem, but the Ramban's, providing a window into this very nuanced question. How do we understand Tumak Sivba Ke'erva? In addition to the Minchas Chinuch, in addition to the Reb Chaim, in addition to the 4 areas, or 5 really, that I've mentioned, namely no tfisas kedushin problem, no mamzeru problem, no capital offense, not nachremos kedoshim, and the 5th, this is not a problem between Yavam and Yavama. This is a problem between husband and wife. Okay. The Rashba goes even further. If you look at the next entry, it says Kedusha Rashba. The Rashba says something even more extreme. So, 1 second. If you go to, I want to save time, so the Od Yesh Mefarshim, this is the 2 lines from the bottom. The Od Yesh Mefarshim, the Sota Lav Mishum Ervahi, right? Like the first view of the Ramban, but you'll see it's sharper. Sota isn't really erva, but then he adds, Vihi bas yibum. On a certain level, she's yibum material. He doesn't mean that you could be miyabim her, because you can't. That's what Rav said. Vihi bas yibum elashemaseha haroim gormula uksiv ba tuma karayos. So the Rashba goes considerably further than the Ramban. The Ramban says no, it's equal to erva because it says tuma, the first answer of the Ramban, but it isn't really erva. Then you have the second answer of the Ramban. It's erva. It's not zakla la suye. It's plain old erva. Now you have the Rashba going further than the first pshat and saying, it's not really erva. You would even be able to do yibum. It's just as a artificial obstacle. She behaved in such a way that she made it, improper to do yibum. But she isn't really an erva. By saying she's an erva, we're just saying there's an obstacle that's the equivalent of the obstacle of erva. But on some level, she's even a bas yivume. The Ritva, if you look at the Ritva, says as follows: the bottom line, the last line. Aval sota shedavar acher goram lo lasos erva, ulahamida be'isur eshasi ach lo kori le erva. What is it? It's isur acher goram lo. Like the Rajba, just in a different way, he's saying this isn't erva at all. So, in light of this, we can appreciate that I've said a few times that the standard view of the Mefarshim here is that the din of sota, the exclusion of sota and tzara sota, applies to chalitza, to yibum, etc. But there are, I've implied, or maybe I said it, that there are some minority disputants, people who disagree with this conclusion. Who are the disputants? So one of them is no land, very important ones. One is the Ravid, and the other is the Ra'ah. So if you look now on page 2 of the Mar Makomos, so on page 2 of the Mar Makomos, I believe it's 2, you have Chidushei Ramban also, Masechet Yevamos. This is Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. Everybody have that? Okay. I'm not going to wait for an answer because I don't want to compromise people's, proper protocol behavior. Okay. So if you look at the Ramban, there are 3 small paragraphs. Right, the Ramban starts off with very small paragraph. I'll get back to them. I'm going to go to the 3rd. The Ramban quotes the Rabbi. Pasak Rabbeinu, says the Ramban, referring to the Rif and the Rambam. Kirav, we paskin like Rav. The afilu lechalitza, that excludes sota even from chalitza. However, he adds the harayvid kasav, sugya dishmaitza, avagav dechsiv batuma, boy chalitza, ohi otsarasa. The Rabbi says, not true. It's not true. A sota and a tzara sota, whichever one you want to use to exempt the zika, they are subject to chalitza. There's just no yibum, but there is chalitza. Why? Afagav dichsiv batuma. The Gemara says it's tuma ke'erva, and in erva there is not only no yibum, but there's no chalitza either. Nonetheless, boy chalitza, ohi otzarasa, the ilu isa lebal milo boy get, hashtanami boy chalitza v'tzarasa kemosa. So this is a line we're going to see in a couple of minutes, a line from the Gemara in Masechet Sota in the very beginning. We'll see in a minute. The Gemara asks the following question. The Gemara says, the Mishnah says in Sota, that in Sota Safek, let's look at the Gemara just for a minute. It'll help us. Look on page 4, I believe. On page 4, we have Talmud Babli Masechet Sota Dav Beis Amud Aleph. Everybody have that? Hamakani leishto Rabbi Lazar Makani la al pi shtayim, right? And Mashka al pi echad, al pi atzmo. Rabbi Yeshua Omer Makani la al pi shnayim, Mashka al pi shnayim. Ketzin Makani la. I'll explain all this in a minute. Omer lo b'fnei shnayim al tedabri imish ploni, the dibra imo, adayin hi muteris lebesa umuteris lachol betruma. Ichneses imo lebesa seiser, shos imo kedei tuma. Asura lebesa v'asura lechol betruma. Yemeis choletzes v'lo musyavem. What is this all about? Again, this is the parsha that we just read on this past Shabbos, Parshas Naso. It's called Safek Sota. A man suspects that his wife is, behaving improperly, so he warns her in front of witnesses, and he says, "Listen, I am suspicious of your conduct. And I hereby warn you not to closet yourself, not to go in a private place with Plony, with this fellow that, I'm suspicious that perhaps your behavior, is not consonant with your wedding vows. So if she ignores the kinui and there is a stira, even though we don't know what happened. We just know that she went somewhere, in private with this fellow. So that's called kinui ustira. So then there can be a whole process of hashkas, mayim or mesota, bring the korban, bring to the kohen, a whole rigorous procedure. But if that doesn't happen, if there's only kinui and stira, so the fact that she violated the warning already creates a suffix sota, it's called. And the Gemara says that suffix sota is kevadai, l'chumra. In other words, it isn't treated as a regular suffix, it's treated as a, to use the language of the Gemara, yesh raglayim l'davar, he warned her. She ignored the warning and brazenly, proceeded, to defy, that suspicion or to feed that suspicion. And therefore, until she's proven innocent, it's called suffix sota, and though there are, we separate them and so on and so forth. But the Mishnah says, so what would happen if this happened and then the husband died, right, without leaving children? So that's the end of the Mishnah, where the Mishnah says there would be no yibum under these conditions of suffix sota, but there would be chalitza. So actually, our Gemara on Daf Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph, and Amud Beis asks this question. The Gemara says, if you look here for a moment, and then I'm going to come back to the Gemara in Sota, just give me a second. The Gemara in Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph, on the bottom of the page, says Maser Ravashi. This is 3 lines up from the bottom of the page on Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph. Nichnasi mo l'seiser v'shasi mo kedei tuma asur lebesa asur lechol betruma. The amaze choletes, right? Below misyavemes. That's a quote from the end of the Mishnah in Sota that we just read on Daf Beis Amud Aleph in Sota. So the Gemara says, "What? There is chalitza. How come our Gemara seems to say there's no yibum and there's no chalitza?" So the Gemara's answer is Amalach Rav. As on Yud Aleph on the base, we just turned the page. Amina lachana sota vadai va'amr sliat sota safek. So the Gemara says our case in Gemara, the Rav is a case where there are witnesses, and we're dealing with a sota vadai. The Mishnah in Sota is dealing with a suffix. In the case of suffix, there's chalitza. In the case of vadai, at least according to most Rishonim, there is no chalitza. But the Rabbi understood it differently. The Rabbi understood that really the Gemara in Sota thinks even Sota vadai, there is chalitza. Why? Because of the following. So go back now to the Gemara in Sota Hey Amud Beis, also on page 4. So the Gemara commenting on the Mishnah says, Imeis choletzes amai. The Gemara says, why do you need chalitza? Only tisyavem nami vume. Why isn't there also yibum if it's only a suffix? Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Kra, v'yotzim b'beisa v'holcha v'hoisa li'isha acher, li'isha acher v'lo li'yavam. We have a limud, says that, if their marriage is destroyed because of her betrayal, so then he should divorce her, v'yotza v'hoisa li'isha acher, but she can remarry someone else. But li'isha acher, the drasha is v'lo li'yavam. She cannot, create a marriage with the yavam in a case where there are no children to the husband. So
but
that's
she can do it. She can apply for chalitza then?
What's that? Say again?
Can she apply? But can she request chalitza?
Oh, yeah. So there is chalitza. So that's the next. The Mishnah says there's chalitza, but no yibum. I mean, she can't just go out and marry who she wants. She needs a chalitza. So the Gemara says, Amalei Abaya, listen to this. Since it's exactly what you asked. If there's a limud that says la'acher v'lo liyavam, maybe she shouldn't need chalitza either. So here's the line in the Gemara. The Gemara says, Amarle, ilu isa labal mila boy get. If the husband was still alive, wouldn't he have to divorce her? Their marriage isn't over and she can just, go marry whoever she wants. She still needs a divorce. Hashtanami tibai chalitza. So from the yavam, even though he can't marry her, just like the husband couldn't marry her, couldn't continue the marriage. But in both cases, in order to be matir her l'shuk, you need a heter, you need a get from the husband. You would need a chalitza from the yava. So this Gemara is technically talking about sota safek, I mean a case where there's kinui and stira, even though we don't have any witnesses. So it's a little bit less of a, an explicit or a certain, violation. But that's what the Gemara is talking about. So now if you look back at the Ravid, go back now to page, I'm sorry to jump around so much, but this is what we do, right? On page 2, go back to the Ravid. So the Ravid said, even in Sota Vada, you need chalitza. Against the Rashi and against Tosas and against the Ramban and against the Rambam. Why? One more time. Haravid kosav sugi deshmaitza afagav the ksiv tuma boy chalitza. Ohi o tzara. So you need chalitza. Why? The ilu isa labal milo boy get. Ashtanami boy chalitza. Vitzarasa kamosa. Now, where does that line come from? You could put quotations around that line. That line, that's why it always helps to have, background information. That line is a straight out quote of the Gemara in Sota, which says, even if there's not going to be a path forward in this marriage, it doesn't mean you don't need a resolution that formally frees her. You would have needed that from the husband to move forward. You'd need a get. And for the Yavam, you need a chalitza. So the Rabbi thought that is true also, not only for Sota Safek. The Rabbi thought it was true for Sota Vada as well. What about our Gemara? So the Ramban says, the way the Ramban understands it is, the Ravid understood that there's an argument between the Gemara in the beginning of Sota and the Gemara in Yevamos. They're mutually exclusive. There's a disagreement among the Tanaim. And we paskin, the Ravid thinks like the Gemara in Sota, not like the Gemara in Yevamos. There's a dea in the, there's a commentary called Tosas Chad Mikamoi. You see it on the side of the page in Yevamos. So he was a contemporary of the Ravid in Provence. So he had agreed with this analysis, but came to the opposite conclusion. He said, there seems to be an argument between Sota and Yevamos, whether or not there's chalitza for a Sota and a Tzaras Vadai. But instead of the conclusion of the Ravid, which is, so you need a chalitza because we paskin like Sota, the Tosas Chad Mikamai says, so we paskin like the Gemara in Yevamos, and therefore you don't need chalitza. Hard to know whether he would think you wouldn't need chalitza also for Safek Sota. That would probably not be correct. But at least for Vadai Sota. Okay. Anyways, the Ramban was troubled by this question, meaning even if the Gemara in Sota is talking about Safek Sota, the question seems to be a good question. Just because there's no Yibum doesn't mean that you shouldn't need Chalitza, just because they can't live together anymore, husband and wife, doesn't mean she doesn't need a get in order to marry someone else. So now look back at the Ramban. Look at the second paragraph of the Ramban. Ramban, Hodam Rina b'Masechet Sota Parakama Elimiata Chalitza Nami Loli Boy. Amar Rav Yosef Ilu Isel Baal Milo Boy Gita Ashtanami Boy Gita. Basically, the Ramban, who later on is going to explain the Ravid in this way, was troubled by this. Because how can our Gemara seem to say there's no Chalitza in a Sota Vadai when the Gemara in Sota says that logically, he shouldn't be better than the husband who has to give her divorce. He has to give her Chalitza. So the Ramban says very kind of, quizzically, Rav leisle hai taima, the kimin chsebe tuma karayos, tur min chalitza min yibum. Meaning Rav here doesn't agree with that line in the Gemara in Sota, or doesn't apply that line to Sota Vadai. Why not? So this Ramban doesn't explain so much. But I think that the answer is as follows, and now we're going to go back to answer all the questions that we, have been discussing. Just 1 second, I have to find I don't have a clock here, so I'm going to make sure that I'm not going too much over time. Okay. So what do we ask? This whole Gemara of Sota, Vadai Sota is treated like an erva. Right, and according to most, there's no yibum, there's no chalitza. There's an exclusion also of tzara, So it's all based on Tuma Ke'erva. But as we've noted, and that's where we went to Daf Chaf, and we looked at the 2 days of the Ramban and the formulation of the Rashba and the Ritva, and we talked about the Minchas Chinuch and Rab Chaim, and now we're talking a little bit about the Gemara and Sota and the Ravid, meaning to say that the legally Sota is an erva is one thing. But what do we mean by that when it's not Nachremos? There is Tfisas Kiddushin, there's no Mamzerus, there's no capital crime. And maybe the biggest issue of all, it's not even a problem between the Yavam and the Yamama. The whole problem was between the husband and the wife. So what is this all about? So what we did show, I think successfully, is that there's an ambiguity in this statement. I mean, the idea that Tumah is Ke'erva, and therefore it's treated as Erva, like how, how minutely, I guess, do we believe that legally? Well, when I say A is similar to B or A equals B, I can either mean it in B'kol Prateha, or I can say, A and B are different. When I say A equals B with regard to a particular application, I mean it just with regard to that overlap. I don't mean in general. Good. So that we've seen. But the bigger question is, why are we extending erva in this way, given all the discrepancies? And the even bigger question than that is, if this isn't a problem between the Yavam and the Yavama, why is it a problem at all? All other cases of erva and Chayve Lavin V'aseh, they're all problems between the Yavam and the Yavama that block, that obstruct, Yibo. But here, there's no legal halachic, aside from this din, right? There is no other problem between the two parties. So what's going on here? So I think that there are two perspectives to pursue. One based on Rashi in Kiddushin and Sota in this actual sugya, and in the Sfarno that we spoke about in the beginning of the year. So as we explained, when the Torah uses the expression, that the Kiyeshu Achim Yachtav, and so on, introduces the din of Yibum, it refers to a case of, Eshes Hames. That's the expression that's used. And the question is how literally to take that. And this is a big, massive issue. Here, it's very important in this application, but it's also has a life of its own. The issue of, the nature of Zika, of this kind of, limbo state where, she's tied to the actions of Yibum and Chalitza, but nothing has yet happened. But what do we mean by the Eshes Hames? Do we really mean that there's some remnant of the previous marriage because there was no closure with a child, or he has no closure because he didn't have a child at least, and as such, she's still Eshes Hames. He's not alive. Normally say that, the Mishnah says in Kiddushin Dabes that Kones Atzma b'misas habal. But maybe that, there's not a kinyan Atzma b'misas habal when he dies, b'li banim. That's what Yibum is. Instead, she remains Eshes Hames. In that respect, again, the Sfarno was arguing, both in Vayishlach and in Kitetse, that on some level, right, the Yibum is a partnership between the Erison of the dead brother, deceased brother, and the Yibum or the Nesuin of the brother. And if you look in Rashi in a few places and the Ramban in a few places, this idea of some sort of continuity or stepping into the ishus of the brother has strong roots. In some Gemaras, it seems to be. The Gemara discusses, for example, in Kiddushin, Daf Yud Gimel, and in Bava Basra, Daf Kuf Lamed Hey, Gemara discusses the issue, the Gittin, also in Perek HaMegaresh, that when it comes to an Eshes Ish, the Gemara wants to compare Eshes Ish and Zika Vibum. So the Gemara says, listen, in Eishes Ish, who oser v'hu matir, he's the one responsible for her being off limits to the rest of the world. And therefore, he's also the one who, by giving her a get or by dying, is matir her. But in Yibum, sometimes the Gemara says, the mace is the oser, and the yavam is the matir. Not so obvious. And then the Gemara, in some cases, says, no, the yavam is also the oser and the matir. So this is an important issue, like whose ishus to what extent is the ishus of the mace being continued? So, like the Gemara says in Kiddushin on Daf Daled Amud Beis, very important Gemara, very famous. The Gemara says, let's learn Kiddushay Bia from Yibo. So the Gemara says, you can't do that. Ma liyibum or ma liyivama shekain zekuka v'omedas. Because, Kiddushay Bia, there's no previous relationship, right? There's nothing to connect these two people. And we want to know from the blue, just like Kesef works and Shtar works, does the intimacy of Kiddushay Bia, does that work too? That's one thing. But in Yibum, there's already a relationship. Shekain's kuka v'omedes, because there's Zika, she's kuka. So what does that mean? So there are broadly speaking, two interpretations. Rashi in Kiddushin says Shekain's kuka v'omedes means she comes to him from the ishus of the brother of the deceased. So in a way, she's Gomer, the Erison of the brother, is combined with the kind of Nesuin of the Avam. That's how Rashi interprets. So it's interesting that in the Gemara in Sota, when the Gemara says maybe there shouldn't be chalitza either, because it says la'acher v'yotzav hoysel ish acher v'lo liyavam. If you remember the Gemara that we just read, and that the Rabbi is quoting, and that the Ramban is troubled by. So the Gemara says, well, what are you talking about? If the husband was still alive, he'd have to give her a get. So the Yavam has to give a chalitza. That's the Gemara. So if you look at Rashi on that Gemara, Rashi says, and after all, isn't it really true that on some level, the Yavam is just stepping into the marriage of the brother? So if the brother would have to give a get, then he should have to give a chalitza. And in the continuation of that Gemara, which I'm not going to read right now because it'll take too long, but in the continuation of that Gemara, so Rashi again says that on some level, the betrayal of the husband by this wife, by this sota, is not something that you could just walk away from. And that's the pshat in a way of la'acher v'yotzav hoysel ish acher v'lo liyavam, because the yavam is the continuation of the marriage of the mace. So the offense to the deceased husband, not a matter of the past, because on some level, right, this is a picking up of that very marriage, and it comes with all the baggage, and that's why there's no yibo. So one way to explain this very strange phenomenon, both in Matsu Grushoso and especially in Sota, namely that unlike all the other cases that we're comparing it to, which are obstacles in the relationship that are unique to the status of the Yavam and the Yavama, here the problem is between the brother, the deceased brother and his wife. What does that have to do with the Yavam and Yavama? So one answer to that question certainly is, and I believe according to Rashi, certainly, and that is that, these are not separable ishuyos. These marriages are connected. He, in some respects, is stepping into his brother's marriage. Right? So I don't want to overstate that, but there is that principle, and therefore the betrayal, the toxic damage, let's say, within that initial marriage continues to impact the potential of Yavam and Yavama. And this would explain why it is that, notwithstanding this very important difference, you can apply this principle. However, what I'd like to point out, just give me 1 second, I'm going to go to the Rambam. One second, I'm not seeing it. Oh, here it is. Oh, I should know that it's always on my desk. I don't think the Rambam subscribes to this perspective of the of Rashi, of the Ramban, etc. Namely, this idea that on some level the Yibum, is a continuation, or partly at least, is based on the framework of the Ishus of the mace. Temperamentally, I don't think it's something that the Rambam was comfortable with. I'll say that from many points of view, both from an Ishus point of view and from a rationalism point of view. I think he had, trouble with that. But in addition to that, the Rambam has a unique emphasis. I say the word emphasis because his formulation has earlier roots, but we're not going to have a chance. Maybe next week we can do this a little bit more. But I don't have time right now to, flesh out the implications of where this source for this formulation comes from and how the Rambam used it in a very unique way. But I should have put this in the Marmakomos. I apologize for not. But the Rambam begins Hilchos Yibum v'Chalitza, literally Parak Aleph Halacha Aleph, by addressing a problem that doesn't appear explicitly in the Gemara, but that is kind of a very natural question that everybody has to deal with, and that is, where's the Erison in Yibum? Okay, meaning Yibum, you go straight to the Yibma, to the Maisabia Midoraisa, whereas in a regular Ishus you have to have Kiddushay Kesef, Kiddushay, even Kiddushay Bia, but you don't go right to the Nesuin effect. So how can you skip that, if you will? So that troubled the Rambam. It's curious that it troubled him so much that he starts. So the Ram starts Hilchos Yibum v'Chalitza. Listen carefully. He starts off by enumerating the mitzvah, but then immediately he launches into this problem, which is so interesting. Mitzvah semin Torah sheyavim adam eisha sachav me'aviv. This is Parak Aleph Halacha Aleph. Bein min hanesuin, bein min ha'erisin. Okay. Whether the brother was fully married to Suin or only Erison doesn't make a difference. Either way, im mace below zera shenemar bein ein lo yivama yavolah. Then the Rambam adds, here's where he's already. This is the first halacha. You'd think that he would be, confined, to things that are explicit in the Psukim and the Mishnayos and the Gemara, but he's already, troubled by. He can't wait to address this question. So he says, Min Torah eno tzarich lekadesh yivamto. Min Torah, he doesn't need to be mekadesh the yavama. Why? Shazu ishtohi shehiknu lo min hashamayim. So this is a fascinating ela yavo alehu ksuvasal nitzei bala shemes. So the Rambam says you don't need a separate Erison because Yibum is called Hiknelo Min Hashemayim. So briefly, I'll discuss it more next week. I believe this is based on it's based on a Gemara in Yevamos on Daf Lamed Tes that the Rambam is quoting here. That's why there's no Ksuva is al Niksei Bala Shemes. That's connected to this notion of Hiknelo Min Hashemayim. But I believe it's also based on the Mishnah in Nedarim, an Ayin Daled Omid Aleph, where the language of one of the Tanoim in the Mishnah, importantly, that the Ram doesn't paskin like, but he thinks the principle is acceptable, is that Yibum is called Hiknelo Min Hashemayim. Literally, the Rabboni Shalom, created this kinyan between the parties. So the Rambam isn't saying that. The Rambam is not saying that in fact. the Arison is unnecessary completely, nor is he saying that the Arison is provided by the mace, which is what some others, including Rashi, say. What he's saying is Hikna lo min hashamayim. So it's Hikna lo min hashamayim. Then the question remains: why is the baggage of the marriage of the the original husband and wife? Why is that an obstacle for Yibum when there's no problem objectively in the relationship of the Yavam and the Yavama? That's the problem. That's the question that we're interested in. So again, we don't have the luxury of the Rashi answer. But I think that the answer is as follows. And with this, I'm going to conclude for today. All year, we've been explaining that on the one hand, Yibum is a tremendous kula, right? Because we're allowing something which is not only out of the ordinary, but breaks very fundamental rules, right? Eshes ach, it sounds like you were just flashing the psukim there. Eshes ach is one of the ervas in Achrimos and in Kedoshim. It's a capital offense. There's typically, in a situation where there's no Yibam, there's no Tfisas Kedushin, there would be Mamzerus, and so on. All this we're setting aside for a greater good, L'Hakim L'Achid Shem B'Yisrael. But what I've tried to show all year round is that there's a very strong perspective in the Mefarshim which says that we're not abandoning the principle of Kedusha for the pragmatic benefit of L'Hakim L'Achid Shem B'Yisrael, of producing an heir. What we're doing is we're trying to figure out the most sanctified way to proceed, right, in a very delicate situation, in a way that will secure not only the legacy of the dead husband, but also the future of his wife, who not only married him, but married into his family, and therefore who should be the recipient of the added sense of responsibility and the wider family insulation that comes with it. So what we've been explaining all along with Abba Shol and other things is that what I call Kedushas, there's a concept of Kedushas Ishus Shel Yibum. Kedushas Ishus Shel Yibum is the idea that even though Yibum is breaking rules, Yibum has to be done on a certain level. So, of course, that's the reason why you can't ignore the obstacles, halachic obstacles that divide two people. So if the relationship of the Avam and Yavama, is at the expense of Dinei Arayos, you're not going to go that place. However, if this is really the perspective on Yibum, so then it shouldn't be limited only to obstacles between the Avam and the Yavama that are technical. What are we trying to accomplish here? At the end of the day, we're trying to secure the legacy of the brother. And we're trying to, build on and, secure also, right, the role of his wife in the family. So, Ein lecha chisaron gadol misota. When you think about it, the problem of sota is not that technically there's a problem and therefore you can't do yibum, because there isn't. It's not a problem between the yavam and the yavama. But what's the kind of marriage, what kind of toxicity in this marriage, still makes it worth securing or breaking rules for? That's the problem. And I believe that's the issue for the Rambam, of all people. The Rambam is saying it's hiknalo min hashamayim, but it's hiknalo min hashamayim for the sake of L'Hakim L'Achiv Shem. You're not going to do that when he would have had to divorce her. You're not going to do that when the whole Yisod, the concept of Kedushas Ishus, right, which you want now to mold, in very unique fashion, to fit into, notwithstanding the rule breaking of Yibum. That's what you're trying to do here. But you can't do that if the whole foundation is toxic. Like, what are you securing? Right? This is a marriage that has failed. It's a marriage, if he was still alive, would have to be terminated. So when the Rambam says, I'll read the line in a minute. I'll read the line. So this is Hiknu Lamanat Shemai. But when the Rambam says in Perek Vav of Hilchos Yibum, what is it? Halacha Yud Gimel. The Rambam says the following: Hoisa hayavama asura al bala mishum lav or mishum aseh. If the yavama had a illegal halachic relationship with her husband, not a betrayal. Let's say she was a grusha, he was a kohen, something like that. But this is not something that affects the yavam, right? Then all things being equal, there could be yibum. However, there are two exceptions. That's halacha Yud Gimel. And then you have halacha Yud Tes, where the Rambam says, Isha shazin satachas bala baratzon, that's our case of sota, ube'edim, umeis kodem shigarshen of anafla lifnei yavam, harei p'tur min hachalitza min hayibum, v'chein tzarasa, ki'ilo eisa erva ala yavam, shetum aksuva b'karayos, shenemar v'hi nitma'a. So the Rambam says there are two exceptions where we care about the problems between the yavam and the between the mason and the isha, not just the problem between the yavam and the yavama. One is masu grushaso, and the other is sota. And of course, masu grushaso and sota are connected, according to the continuation of the Gemara in Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis. Actually, the psukim in Parshas Kitetse are a continuation of the parsha about masu grushaso, also contain critical information about the lab of sota. As Ramban explains, in a way, every sota is masu grushaso, and every masu grushaso, I'm expanding a little bit, is sota. Because what we're really saying is, as we discussed last year a little bit when we learned Gittin, that is, if you allow masu grushaso even after an intervening marriage, what you're doing is you're using the institutions of marriage and divorce basically to organize a life of znus, of promiscuity. What you're saying is, I'll go back and forth between partners. I'll do it all legally. I'll have a hall on standby and a rabbi on standby. You do a little marriage, you do a little divorce, you do another marriage, you do another divorce, you do another marriage, another divorce, and you make a chucho tlula, you make a mockery of the institution of marriage. That's what the Ramban calls, or what I call in the name of the Ramban, musical marriages. That is not acceptable in terms of Kedushas Ishus, the institution. On another level, once she has been married to someone else, for her to return to you, it's almost like a sota. And when there's a sota, it's almost like a masu grushaso, because to go back and to continue the marriage after the betrayal is you can't recapture, right, that that idealism and that Kedushas Isha's part. So in a way, the two exceptions to the rule, if there's a problem between Yavam and Yavama that can't be overcome, then there's no Yibum. And in some cases, there's no Chalitza. But if there's a problem with wife, that's not a problem. But if it's a problem of Sota or Masu Grushaso, then there's no Yibum and possibly no Chalitza either. Because that is the toxicity of the marriage. Why are we saving this marriage that, is not a representation of Ki Yesh V'Achim Yachtav, of Kedushas Ishus? So that's what I think is going on in this particular topic, and I hope to continue to develop that more fully going forward. The Chazan looked like the Chazan had a question.
Next week, right? Rabbi,
yes, so we have one more share next week. And I'm going to answer, since you flashed the pasuk here, at least I'm getting the pasuk. So this is the pasuk in Kedoshim. You have to look at the Ish asher yikach es eshes achiv nidahi, ervas achiv gila, aririmu, does in Chazal means not only, it's kares variri. So the translation is they will remain childless, but it also means that there is a kind of a kares. If you want to see more about that, Tosas and Beis Amud Aleph in Yevamos discusses different views of what ariri means. But let me also add this Gemara, this pasuk that you're showing me. That's I don't know if everybody else has it. Isha shayikach eseshes achiv nidahi is we discussed this pasuk very extensively. based on the Gemara's discussion on Nun Dalid Amud Aleph. The Gemara in Yevamos, Nun Dalid Amud Aleph, raises the question: why is a Eishasach called a Nida? And basically, the Gemara basically says that like a Nida, as opposed to all other ervas, there is a heter. In Nida, there's a heter lachar zman. She, is mistaher, and then she's no longer a Nida. So it's a temporary state. In the case of Eishasach, it's not a temporary state, but if there are no children, there's an exception, and that's Hibum. That's, if you want to look at that, that is, I'll just find it to make sure. I believe it's the Gemara discusses that question on Nun Dalid Amud Aleph. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's what the Gemara says on the bottom here. Yeah. That's on Nun Dalid Amud Aleph in the bottom part of the Gemara. The Gemara says, why is it? And then if you want to see it more extensively, on Nun Dalid Amud Beis is where the Gemara asks the question, right? The Gemara says, I'll just read you the line. Nida diksiva gabe eshasach, this is Nun Dalid Amud Beis, lamali. Like, why does it call Nida and eshasach together? So the Gemara says, Remez li'ivama minatar minayin aksivi v'am yabola. El remez li'ivama shasur b'chai bala minayin haisvarahi. So the Gemara says that because the Torah compares it to a Nida, it's a way of saying that there's an exception to it. Okay, but that's, But Arira Miyu means childless, but it also means that the parties themselves are subject to what we call Misa Bidei Shemayim. And Tosas on the base of Omid Aleph in Yevamos, here, it's the Tosos. If you want to look, Dibramasal Ashes Achiv Me'imo, a large Tosis. If you look at the bottom of that Tosis, in Tomer Lepirish Riva, the Bereisha Bali Vemta, My Parach Ariri, Dichsiv B'Dodaso Lamali. The Tosis discusses what Ariri means. It's base Amud Aleph, the Tosis base Amud Aleph. The second half, Ashes Achiv Me'imo. If you look on base Amud Aleph, I see you're giving me the pages here. Yeah, on base on the first page. Yeah, keep going down. Keep going. Go back a little bit. Go back. A little back. More. A little more. Yeah. So the Tosis said stop. Eshes achiv me'imo. That Tosis discusses on the second half of that Tosis. They discuss here achos le'achos im loksiv ariri. What is ariri? Huvazaro Nichras, Rashi, the second half of that Tosis I'll refer you, and the connection to Nidas, the Gemara on Nun Dalid Amud Aleph and Nun Dalid Amud Beis. Okay, everybody should have a terrific week. We have one more shir. There's much more to talk about in the
Next week.
One more shir next week, and then we'll have yeah.
Okay, and Bab Mitzvah next year, we said, right?
And yes, Bamitzia is on the agenda for next year.
Rabbi, may I just ask
Sure.
Steve,
does this have any relation to do with the Nazir? Because the Nazir sees the Sota in her disgrace.
Well, and that's the Smichas Parsha, meaning in Parshas Naso, that's
right.
what Rashi quotes from the Midrash, that the Parsha of Nazir follows right after Sota.
Right. So
exactly
what I'm saying is, does this have anything to do here with this?
It does, sure.
Right. So for the family's sake, it's almost as if the dead husband or brother have a Nazir relationship to this and remove themselves from any sexual connection to these wives.
Well, I don't know if they need a Nazir relationship for that, but they are separated from it. That is for sure. And that's what the la'acher v'lo liyavam. But I don't know whether that has to be din Nazir. But in the fact that the psukim connect Nazir to
right.
Sota in the sense that not only the lesson but the idea also that the idea of Nazir is the idea of a more ascetic life and an appreciation that even when there is physical life, that it has to be sanctified. I think that is the bigger idea. And so I don't think the brother needs to be Nazir like, but I do think that the next parsha is consistent with not just cause and effect. Oh, he'll see this, he'll do that, which is what
Right.
Drash says. I think the deeper idea is that the Nazir is a way of like exploring physicality, the line between asceticism and physicality. And
Right.
that's
Right.
why there's mostly Judaism believes that physical life can be sanctified and should be sanctified. The Kohen Gadol, who is I guess the most holy in some respects person in terms of his profile, is somebody who has to be married. He can't do the avodah on Yom Kippur. We've spoken about this unless he's a married man. So the idea that in contrast to Christianity, for example, especially Catholicism and other religions, which see asceticism as the goal, and celibacy as a very high level. Judaism really frowns on that, and very much disputes that. But the Nazir, a temporary period of Nazirus in particular, to kind of explore the proper balance and to recalibrate in terms of how much asceticism, how much, and especially on a personal level when you need to adjust your own
May I
focus.
say? May I say? No, I do feel the nausea being me is physical, but what you're also saying, though, even for the Kohen Gadol, he removes himself from his wife for that week.
Yeah, he does.
So
So on the one hand, he removes himself because it's. I mean, also there's a very strong pragmatic aspect, and that is that we don't want him to become ritually defiled because
right.
he's crucial to the. So there's a recognition that that he has to abstain in certain things. But again, if he wasn't married, then he couldn't be the Kohen Gadol. That's because there's a certain empathy that is connected with his role, which being a family person and having relationships definitely cultivates. But in addition to that, it's because marital life and being appropriately, that's the key word, in the right balance, integrated in physical life is an ideal in Judaism, not a not a begrudging compromise. So I think
Thank
both
you.
of those things
Thank
are true.
you.
Anyways, have a great week, everybody, and
Thank you.
look forward to the next year.
Good night.
Good night.
Right.